Hello, today I'm going to be demonstrating how to set up, configure, and use a Raspberry Pi. But first, let's start off with some basics. What is a Raspberry Pi? A Raspberry Pi is this right here. It's what's called an SBC, or a single board computer. And essentially what it is, it's a normal computer, like any other, but all the components that are needed to run a computer are built onto one single circuit board. So while for a normal computer, you might have different components that need to be put into place, with an SBC, all the components are on one single board. Now that we know a little bit about the Raspberry Pi, we can move into how to set up a Raspberry Pi. And you're going to need a few things. First you're going to need is just your Raspberry Pi, obviously. You can't set up a Raspberry Pi without one. Next, you're going to need a keyboard and mouse. Any keyboard or mouse will do that can connect via USB to your Raspberry Pi. Next, you're going to need a monitor or some sort of display output. It could be a TV, a monitor like I have here, or a projector, with an HDMI input device. So just normal HDMI cord you'll need to plug your Raspberry Pi into your display output of your choice. You're next going to need a micro USB power supply. These are just normal smartphone charging cords for many devices like old Samsung phones and old Android phones. You're going to need one of those to power your Raspberry Pi. Next, you're going to need some sort of storage option. So a storage option could range from something like a USB flash drive or to something like this, like an SD card that I have right here. We're going to be using an SD card as the Raspberry Pi has a dedicated port for an SD card. We'll use this storage device to store our operating system and other files that we'll need to store or run on our Raspberry Pi. Next, we're going to need some sort of cooling solution. So while normal computers have some sort of built-in cooling solution like a cooling fan or water cooling, something like that, since the Raspberry Pi is simply just a board, we're going to have to buy some other method in order to cool our Raspberry Pi. Because as like all other computers, the Raspberry Pi generates heat, and if we don't take care of that heat, the Raspberry Pi will implode and burn up. So we can pretty much go through two options here. We have something like this, which is a pretty overkill solution for cooling the Raspberry Pi, or we can go for something like this, a small aluminum heatsink that we will put onto the central processing unit of our Raspberry Pi. Now, the central processing unit of your Raspberry Pi is what is essentially the brain of the computer, and it's what generates the most heat. So we're going to be applying this small heatsink onto the central processing unit of our Raspberry Pi. Now, this information of where the central processing unit is can easily be available in your Raspberry Pi documentation. So we're just going to apply that right there. Now that we have everything in place, we can begin to plug everything together and turn on our Raspberry Pi in order to configure it. But before we do that, I need to mention one more thing about setting up your Raspberry Pi, and that is your operating system. Normal computers today come with a preloaded operating system like Windows 10 or Mac OS. But with the Raspberry Pi, because when you buy a Raspberry Pi, you just get the single board computer, we're going to need to install some sort of operating system on our storage space. So in this case, we're going to have to install some sort of operating system onto our SD card. And this is where the usability of the Raspberry Pi is astronomically large compared to other computers. With the Raspberry Pi, you can essentially install any operating system you want free of charge. So in this case with our Raspberry Pi, we're going to be using what's called Raspbian, which is the intended OS created by the creators of the Raspberry Pi for the Raspberry Pi, hence its name Raspbian. Now, Raspbian is based off the open source operating system known as Linux. And there are millions, well, not millions, but hundreds of different distributions of Linux used for different machines. So with Raspbian, we have one that's engineered for the Raspberry Pi. Now, your list of options obviously doesn't end with Raspbian, as there are thousands of other operating systems that you can use with your Raspberry Pi. As I mentioned earlier, this can range from even professional operating systems like Windows 10 to your own operating system based off a Linux distribution. It's really your own choice depending on the requirements that you need from your Raspberry Pi. But as I said before, we're going to be using Raspbian for our OS for this Raspberry Pi demonstration. All we need to do is have our SD card with the Raspberry Pi's operating system, load onto it, plug it into the Raspberry Pi, and then we can plug in everything else. So we have our power cord, which will plug in directly to the Raspberry Pi. We have our display output that will plug into the Raspberry Pi. Then we have our keyboard and mouse, which we will plug into the Raspberry Pi. And then finally, we can hit the power switch on our power supply. As we wait for that to boot up, I'm going to explain a few of the advantages of using Raspbian, the intended OS for the Raspberry Pi, that I have loaded onto this micro SD card. Now, because Raspbian is the intended OS for the Raspberry Pi, it comes chocked full with programs that are intended for the Raspberry Pi and that are quite usable in pretty much any scenario. This can range from Minecraft versions intended specifically to the Raspberry Pi to programming applications that allow you to program your own programs and run them with any hardware that you might have attached to the Raspberry Pi. With Raspbian, the possibilities are pretty much endless with the applications that you are provided. So as we get our system booted up, we are now in the operating system of the Raspberry Pi, which in this case is Raspbian. And we can see that on the sidebar we have dozens of programs that we can use for all sorts of stuff. And keep in mind, this isn't a comprehensive list. There are hundreds of other programs that you can download just for the Raspbian OS, and thousands of other programs that you can download for all the operating system that can be used with the Raspberry Pi. So over here we have all the applications that I mentioned earlier, and you can do whatever sort of configuring you like. With the intended OS for the Raspberry Pi with Raspbian, the configuring process is relatively simple. If you used a computer before, you can use Raspbian. Up on the top right, you have your network settings, your audio settings, your time, your date, anything you might need for just configuring and setting up your Raspberry Pi for the first time. And this would come familiar to any sort of computer user. This is where these systems are located for Windows 10, for Mac OS. As you can see, it's pretty much the same like any other operating system. So now that we know how to set up and configure the Raspberry Pi, we can get into some of the uses of the Raspberry Pi. Now, the great thing about the Raspberry Pi, as I mentioned earlier, is the availability of different operating systems that can be used for the Raspberry Pi. But additionally, there are hundreds of different hardware, different types of hardware that can be used with the Raspberry Pi. Now, unlike a normal computer, the Raspberry Pi has what's called GPIO pins, and these essentially allow the Raspberry Pi to communicate with various devices that cannot be plugged in via Ethernet or USB. So this presents a significant advantage compared to other computers, as you can connect normal everyday electronics, like let's say a light bulb or a motion detector or something like that, and be able to program with them using the Raspberry Pi. For instance, if you wanted to directly control a light bulb, or let's say a dehumidifier or a humidifier or a heater, for instance, you can connect the Raspberry Pi to these devices without any proprietary connectors and control them via programming. So as you can see, the Raspberry Pi already offers significant advantages compared to other computers in the enthusiast market, if you're programming your own programs or needing to control something. But what about for the normal everyday user? The Raspberry Pi is a great option. As you can see, the normal Raspbian OS is great for use for anybody that's familiar with computers. And with its low price of $35 per board, the Raspberry Pi is a great introduction to the world of computing from a child to an elderly grandparent that might not be too familiar with a computer. And the Raspberry Pi is a great place to start. Its inexpensive design, its practicality in pretty much any field of use, and all the operating systems that are compatible with the Raspberry Pi makes a great option for anyone looking into computing. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed my demonstration.